Hard work, that's what they say. Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work, do it every day.
All right, well, welcome to another Work Ethic podcast, and I'm here today with Dr. Kelly Page, and I actually met Kelly out at Eat Denver, and that was in February. So this is actually a good chance for us to kind of catch up. We've kept up a little bit through, I think, LinkedIn mostly, and been kind of paying attention to some of the work you've been doing. And but recently we reconnected and said, why don't we get some time on the calendar? Now, you know, kind of, I'm going to do like a little brief kind of right off the top of your LinkedIn. Kelly's a social design ethnographer. Is that how you say that? Ethnographer,
Yeah, ethnographer.
social and digital innovator,
Mhm.
learning entrepreneur committed to developing truly social cultures, people, organizations with emerging and social tech. And then the next thing, and then I'm going to just toss you the ball, but I just was, and I'm just eager to jump into this, but Kelly has a PhD in psychology, in the psychology of web knowledge, which I didn't even know was a thing. And I just can't wait to hear all about it. But Kelly, why don't you do a better job than I did, just reading off your kind of top line items, introduce yourself to everyone, and then we'll just start rapping.
All right, John, that's awesome. So firstly, thank you for inviting me on here. And the minute you said that you're looking at my LinkedIn bio, I was like, I'm really curious how you'd introduce me. If you looked at my Twitter bio, my Insta bio.
Yeah, what
you know, we all have these multiple different identities and stuff.
Totally,
so,
absolutely,
on,
we do.
You know, the group. So yeah, so I've been in the web space, really looking at, you know, web skills, web knowledge, how we learn about hypermedia technologies is actually where I started for over, I'm gonna say it, 22 years now. And yeah, I got into it where I was hanging out with data scientists and developers in Australia, in Sydney, in my early 20s. I sort of come out of high school learning a little bit about coding and new technologies. And yeah, so what I do today is really related to that, but a little bit different in the sense a lot of my work is around the social design around technologies and emerging tech. And what I mean by that is tech to me is language, it's art, it's actually, you know, art before it's science. And if you go back to the very beginning of coding, Ada Lovelace, she actually invented what's called poetic science, which was the first coding or algorithmic languages for technology. And so, you know, I really lent in my early days because I'm part artist. So I'm a polymorph, you know, part artist, part and creative, yet also strategist, dev, tech. But a big part of my work is really learning about communities and understanding the lived experience with technologies and just generally our lived experiences, right? So whether it be lived experience of work, of school, of learning, and then how do we build or build technologies for how we live or how we want to live. So that's the ethnography part of me, is I can't help it, but, you know, collect stories, you know, really deeply trying to understand certain things around we as human beings and the cultural resonance of what we do. And so over the years, you know, it started with really learning from and studying devs and how they learn and how they develop and how do you invent languages, because that's what it is, right? So you imagine the dawn of time and the invention of English, Spanish, Japanese, right? We talk about these as languages. Well, the plethora of different coding languages are very similar. So we're building worlds with them, we're building relationships with them. So if I had to sum up what my job is, it's messy. In the most beautiful way, because human beings are messy, are interconnected, but it's really about, you know, developing some understanding. What are the themes or thematics through which, you know, we work and learn? And then how can we actually build technologies so that we can live better, right? It's not just about, you know, efficiency or effectiveness. It's actually the humanness of how we live. And whatever better means for you. If it's happier, richer, wealthy, and wealthy to me is about health, not just finance. So, you know, there's a whole spectrum of things. So I started on my mediated journey in how we live with tech, you know, over 22 years ago. and have followed as developers change the languages, as they develop new technologies, or we have new relationships with them, so too does my work change, right? So the early days of Web 1 is very different to Web 2, which is very different to now, Web 3. And for me, it's all the web. It's even if you look at the early days of Tim Berners-Lee's work on the web and the semantic web, a lot of what we're seeing now is his vision. So, or read Ada Lovelace if you really want to go back to the 1800s and talk about the origin of code and tech. So it's kind of interesting for me in my work. Yeah, I work across contexts, so K-12, higher education, but mostly in employment and career development, working the world of work. What does that mean? What do pathways mean to career opportunities? And especially for some of our most systematically and historically excluded peoples. So does that help?
Oh man, yeah. I was like, okay, I have 700 questions.
And that's
I was like,
plus I paint. I am an abstract artist, and I have that because I
love it. I love it. And by the way, yeah, the amount of places that already set my mind. I'm like, which to go down. Now, I do want to, though, for clarity's sake, as you hit on the like K through 12, so like all the tech and study, but then like the K through 12 in a like practically day to day, like you're working in a school, or you work with youth, or you're working, it's more like the study of the, like, I don't know that I understood that fully.
Yeah, so I have a number of roles in the world of work. One of the main roles I have is I'm actually a director with a national nonprofit called Digital Promise. And Digital Promise was ratified by Congress, opened by Obama over, I think, about 14 years ago. And we focus on the R&D of technology and the digital promise, or the promise of digital, to make education and work accessible for everyone. So we, as an R&D company, whenever we will look at the impact tech is having on learning in schools, the impact it's having on learning in the workplace, on learning in higher education, how we credentializing and what does that mean, how are new technologies like AI, LERs, blockchain, and that's my role at the nonprofit, is emerging tech.
Good.
What are the things that we need to be really looking at there? Because how do we actually build for inclusion? And what does that mean? It's not just about testing tech with different communities. It's actually about building with the intention that everyone can have access to this. But what is that? How do we do that? So my day-to-day varies. Like, I just said to you, I just flew back from Dallas, and I just spent an amazing day with over 50 different educators who are focused on especially Black and Hispanic youth in Texas and their access to opportunities for careers, and what does that mean for them. And so I can go from running co-design workshops with teachers to working with employers to understand the impact tech's having on in their workplace, to hanging out with devs at ETH Denver to really see what's happening under the hood with some of these emerging tech. So it varies.
No, but I'm glad I asked a question, because like when you hear K through 12, and then I think like, oh, like in the school, but this is like what is school, right? Like, or what are the platforms that, exactly, like the mechanisms with which we're okay. So now I want to bunny trail to back to this. So when you were so I was really intrigued by the like, by the way, the way you framed ethnography, which I like, even as I asked, like, do I pronounce this right? Which I was pretty sure I did. I know what it is. But I couldn't say much about that, like in general, but as you were describing it, I was like, I think that's what this show is meant to be, as like this survey of our common relationship with work across varying vocations and whatever. It's just like, I don't know, there was certain like resonance in that. I was like, oh, interesting. I'm accidentally doing a piece of that, and maybe I would love to know more about what what do you do with that?
Well, ethnography is, it's the study of living people, right? Whereas anthropology and archaeology is the study of dead people or cultures past, right? So, and anthropology is the overarching kind of field, yet with ethnography, it's very much about lived culture, and we collect stories. Everything as an ethnographer, it's about collecting over time too. So And data for us as ethnographers, everything is data. A conversation, a photograph, an art piece, a tweet, so depending on the community that I'll be in. So many years ago, I did an ethnography with a national theatre company in the UK, looking at the impact of digital on the work of theatre artists and producers and directors. And so that kind of work it's a multitude of different things you're collecting to get an understanding of how does the system work? What are the themes coming up in the system? And by system, it's people, it's organizations, it's laws, it's practices and norms. And so it's really the study of the system, but it's story-based. At the heart of ethnography is really collecting stories and the meaning that we have in stories and making sense of them. So yes, you're doing ethnography right now.
For a study like that, you're like, oh, so we're going to talk to theater workers, and or directors or whatever across the spectrum of people in this space, and ask them to tell us their story, but also ask them some specific questions around things we're looking into, like how has the advent of this certain kind of tech or high definition or this, or, these things that have become available kind of in your lifetime, how has it changed the game for you, that kind of thing. And then letting them.
Interviews are one part, but most of it, it's participant observation. So it's being in community, hanging out, helping out, working, getting to know people, obviously with informed consent, right? Everyone knows I'm an ethnographer. It's not a secret. They know if I'm there to work, I'm introduced to the community and I develop trust and bonds over time. And so it's really important in ethnographic work to how you take care of the communities you're learning with. And but there's a multitude of different ways to collect information about what's going on in the community to help make sense of it. And I tack on, and this is not usually, most ethnographers study community, they then write a book, articles, and share about it, what they observed. And they share it back with the community in advance of any publication to get confirmation that what came out, Yet I tack on, and this is a little bit controversial in the world of ethnography, because the world of ethnography, it's like you don't impact, you have minimal impact. You're really there just to understand. Whereas I bring in action research at the end, because I grew up in a family where it's all about community. It's all about being of service. It's helping out. And so, I was privileged to have access to certain education and a culture in Australia, an environment. And so now the action research, any insights that come out of the ethnography go back into the community. Okay, what do you want to do with it? What do you want to build? And because the only way, so innovation to me is you have to build something to see change. It's not ideating and talking and even research. Yeah, that's great. Yet if you truly want to impact change in society, you have to build something and then look back and see, did it change something? And if it did, then it's an innovation. We often talk about innovations in the future. I'm going to do. And no, innovation is reflective. So actually, ethnography is a methodology and approach. And to be honest, I can't help but collect anymore because I've been doing it for 22 years. Probably not good for my personal life. But anyway, let's go beyond that conversation.
That's interesting.
Well, it is, because you can't, whether it be photographs, whether it be collecting stories. And I reflect on a lot, so I'm always typing and writing. But then the action research is, how can you share it back in a way that can help whomever you're learning with and hanging out with? And what does that mean? Yeah. So that's what I do.
So when you said, so I occasionally, so you're talking about languages, and I have a question about them, but just, I don't know many, I actually don't know any languages. I know a little bit of stuff from different languages. Greek is probably the thing I paid the most attention to because of probably some just ancient things I wanted to have some access to, but also a lot of etymology. Like etymology is what leads me to a lot of these things. And when you said anthropology about dead people and ethnography about living people, I was like,
archaeology dead people.
I'm sorry, is that what you said? Archaeology.
Dead
digs.
Ethnography
got it.
Anthropology is
all of mankind, right? Yeah. So that's what so I misheard it. Archaeology, which I actually don't know what that is, but because ethnography is for like ethnos, right? Like where we get like ethnic, like it's like the nations. It's like the
ethno is culture. So
Mhm.
or writing of culture. So ethnography is the writing of culture.
Okay.
So that's
Mhm.
what it means. Yeah.
Nice. So so I have this little I have a one question. I'm just curious. It's a so when I was in college, the only thing that could really hold my attention, so I was gonna do really poorly because
Mhm.
I can't stick with something I don't care about, which is like most things. But I had this I took religious studies. I ended up taking a religious studies like one like world religion survey, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting, like what do people think matters most, like that kind of thing. And I got really into mythology and story and like how meaning is conveyed through story. And so that leads into a lot of like philosophy and theology and things like that that emerge. Well, when you said like how do you invent a language, and then you were talking about like tech, like the innovation, like there's these creation of languages that are proliferating, and you're like, and we're building with them, we're building, you say we create worlds with them. And when
Yeah.
you said that, I, you know, that is it sounded like a reference from
Mhm.
like, uh, and he spoke the world into create. So like the word, like words
Mhm.
created the world is actually the story of creation in the kind of Jewish origin story, actually in several origin
Yeah,
stories.
in several spiritual.
And I
Yeah.
was curious when you said that, was that coincidental or is that like
No,
something you've
it
reflected? I was just like curious to hear you muse on that.
yeah, no, it's super interesting because when you think about, so we live in language and we live in language, we build in language. Everything we do is relative to language. And there's so much meaning and different cultural meanings in words that we use, phraseology. And language, by the way, is not just verbal, it's visual.
Yeah.
It's, there's a whole spectrum of different languages we as human beings use by which to coexist, and we're constantly creating.
Mm-hmm.
So in our world we're constantly creating, and we have power over that creation. We have
Mm-hmm.
agency. We might think we're not, but that's how we're being socialized to think.
Mm-hmm.
So in the power of any kind of language, like for example, what you wear is a language, what you listen to is a language, what you cook and eat is language. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's looking at language as symbolic, as symbolism, and how languages fit together gives meaning to different peoples. And what's really important is, and we have multiplicity of languages within languages, right? So, and that's where we
Yeah.
go culture, subculture, and so
Yep.
forth. So, irrespective of whether, of what you believe on the creation of the world or
Sure.
earth or life or what have you, it's interesting to think about how there's an interaction effect as well. It's not one thing happens before the other. Like for example, we build technologies and technologies build us.
Mm-hmm.
It is a constant
Co-creation.
symbiotic,
Yeah.
yeah, interaction effect. So it's this recognizing our agency in the system to change it. And I think I'm trying to remember who said this, and I don't want to do damage to, by not by referring to the wrong person. But it's like when we think about languages, it's who we are is what we build, who we are is what we say. But language is just so powerful in the nature of the words. I'm trying to think about who said that. It'll come to me in a minute. And so my very early work was, and it was through psychology and business and tech, which I did at college. But I was always fascinated as a teenager in artistic practice, sculpture, painting, drawing, a visual expression, colorful expression, everything from what the Impressionists did to Picasso to, it was fascinating with me on how they created. And what was interesting is when I then discovered this world of, yeah, you're building worlds with tech. And
Mm-hmm.
and coding as a language was how it was introduced to me. It was not introduced as a science. That came many years later for many people. So it's super interesting to then go, all right, I can build with this. Just like I can write a story with verbal words, I can create a program, I can build digital worlds. It's just interesting to think about it in that way, as opposed to this being a mathematical science where it's poetic science, right? It's which is
Mm.
what its original way back in the 1800s. That's where poetic science comes from, poetry and science.
I man, I love this. I want to know. So I want to know a lot about I'm like some of the origin or sparks of these, but I want to go further back, I guess. Like
Okay.
let's go way back to your, what is like as far back as you can remember.
Uh-huh.
And you're into words and what they mean. Like when the word work, like what's your earliest memory of like how it came to have meaning, what it meant?
Yeah.
How did your relationship to that concept begin?
Okay. Wow. Um, so I have to say, so for those listening, as you can tell, I am Australian, not British, New Zealander, South
Get it
African.
right.
Just to clarify. But that said, you know, my mother is South African and my father is Australian, British white Australian. And so it's interesting. You know, my mum's background is biracial South African. So you have these worlds of culture. And my grandfather, I would actually say my relationship to work was definitely through my parents' relationship with their work. They ran a family business. My, you know, father was a truck driver, was a superphosphate business in Australia. He started very early in the morning. And as children, you know, we helped out at a very young age, whatever that meant. If that meant mowing the lawns, you mowed the lawns. And there was this kind of link between chores and work, but it was also service, right? You're contributing, and I would say that that's, you know, there was often big discussions in our family around, you know, my dad's work and my mum's work. She ran the business, all the, you know, paperwork around it, in terms of that. And then he did the actual work with the farmers on the farms, right? But they were a team in how they came about it. And then us children, we also worked to contribute. Now, don't get me wrong, we still had fun. We still played and everything. Yeah. But there were things that were part of our world. And then our grandfather, my mother's father, he had a really old avocado farm. And he was an agricultural scientist. And that's where my interest in science actually comes from. And I can talk about that a little bit later. Yet we would visit the farm. And, you know, a working farm, there's constantly things that need to be done for the farm to function, right? So whether it be helping milk the cows, you know, picking the avocados, helping prune the trees, feeding the chickens, you know, at a very young age, us children were part of the life cycle that made that farm happen. And I would say I loved it too. So from, you know, my parents' relationship with work, and my father had a work ethic, you know, it's, and I think Australians do as well. Like we live, you know, we don't live to work, we work to live. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was very much probably my early exposure to the relationship of work in the family. Yeah.
I want to ask you about what you just said, we don't live to work, we work to live. Mm-hmm. I wrestle with that. Okay. And I'll tell you why. And it's partly around the concept of work, right? And because I think a lot of times, like we, and not that I think you're saying that with this, because clearly, like I mean, what I heard, the thing that stood out to me is like us children were part of the life cycle. I was like, oh, as like a answer to like an early memory of work. I'm like, man, that's powerful. Like that's a highlight for me. But then that phrase just on its own, you know, because we often equate work with an economic transaction. And so you go to work. So then we go work-life balance, like work and life are separate. Mm-hmm. And then work is just something you go do so you can get some money so you can go live. And whereas like, you know, like the artist, when you're saying like that might be work for somebody that is like, but it's like, no, it is actually something they live to create. They live to build, they live to do. And a lot of the ways you've referred to work and creation, and it's like even identity, you said who we are is what we build. It's like there's so much significance there that actually surprised me when you said we don't live to work. And I guess I wouldn't say I don't think anyone lives to work. However, work work to live is the part of it that feels like, you get what I'm asking? I'm like, I want to pick it apart.
I totally get what you're asking. Think of it this way a little bit. I'm not talking about work as employment. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about work as performance.
Like living takes work. No, like the life cycle.
Well, living is work, right? But it's not hard work. It's like let's not put meaning around that, the notion of work. So to me, work is an action, an activity, something you do by which to build strength, to build activities, to serve community, to do a whole spectrum of things. It's not, it's like the live to work is that you're living by which to serve strength. Whereas I'm like, no, we work so that we can live a powerful life. And so we're performing and investing in ourselves, because when you are undertaking some kind of activity, whether an artist painting a painting, or you're a farmer who's milking a cow, you're investing in the system, the ecosystem.
That's right.
Let's call it an ecosystem over system, because sometimes we say system and we think some other kind of system. Right? Or it's very value laden, but it's like you're contributing to this ecosystem that is then going to contribute back to you. And so you're working to live, or for the system to live and sustain. And so it's this notion of, I think sometimes when we say work to live and live to work, we can mean employment.
That which is why I double clicked on it, and I'm so glad that I did, because that was beautiful. But exactly that, because I was like, oh, that stood apart from everything else that you were saying a little bit. And by the way, because it is like it's a pithy saying. It's like something that people will throw around and mean differently than you did. So I'm glad I asked. Okay, so from that kind of young chore, like the participation in the farms, and that was Grandpa's farm that you were on?
My grandfather's
avocado farm, you said?
Yeah.
Is that what it was? That's really interesting.
It was avocados, bananas, mangoes. We had some citrus. My parents later, after they sold the business, actually bought a 50-acre citrus and mango farm, which we lived on until I was 18. So up to the age of like 12, we lived on the edge of a country town, and that's when my parents had the trucking business. Yet when we moved to the other side of Australia, my parents bought a farm near my grandparents, and it was mango and citrus. So I would go to school, and then I'd come home, and you'd have to pick lemons, or get on the tractor and slash the grass. And so it's just part of life. It's what you have to do for the system to function. It was never like I'm missing out because I can't, that I have to do this. And don't get me wrong, it was hard work. It was definitely,
for sure. Yeah.
And I think that's why I super appreciate what I do today.
Interestingly, I'm learning a little bit of, like, I don't know if it's geography or what the thing is, but like as you're talking about everything that's growing, I'm like, Australia and Florida seem to be like quite similar climate or something. Is that true? Like, I didn't know that. I had to look at a globe, but I'm like, those are all the things that we could grow.
Yeah. So Florida, so Australia, the North Australia, especially Queensland, that's a lot like Florida. Whereas the southern parts of Australia, New South Wales, are probably more like, and I'm sure someone will ring in and correct me on this, but geography is not my strong suit. But in the southern parts of Australia, it's probably more like maybe parts of Colorado or the Illinois, the Midwest. Except we don't get snow like the Midwest gets snow, right?
Gotta love that.
I did live in Illinois for 11 years. I don't know how. Shoveling snow was definitely work.
I mean, even visiting you guys during Eat Denver, I was like, I don't know how people live like this. That place is anti, I guess. It's the opposite of where I'm from. Like, I'm in Florida, it's flat. That's not flat. It's so altitude, sea level, it's hot, it's freezing, it's humid, it's dry. My body was like, I don't know how to function here.
You need to visit Colorado in the summer, right?
Yeah.
In February in the winter.
Yeah, it was a little chilly. So how do you, now, all the stuff you were kind of talking through, and it sounded like it was pretty early on as you kind of got into what became your like real vocation. I'm curious about, like, from these early memories to there, like, walk us through some of that, like connecting them. Like, where did you meander to find, how did this come to be a passion and a pursuit for you?
I will link it to the farm work, and I'll link it to my grandfather and also my own dad. My father and my mom was a teacher, so that's I would see what she would do and how she inspired young children. So that's the learning interest, and really being of service to people in learning. Yet my father and my grandfather, it was interesting. So every time we'd visit my grandfather's farm. He was an agricultural scientist. So in his day job, so the farm was his side hustle, by the way. It was his retirement.
Yeah.
But it was also where he would run experiments on the trees if they had disease. So he actually bought this very small farm next to his farm, because it had all this disease in the trees. They were going to bulldoze all the trees. And he bought the farm, and he did all these experiments to, how do you save the trees? How do you, address the disease? So I remember as a young child, and I don't know what this is going to sound like, but following behind him, he gave me like a little clipboard, and I had my little pen, and he would make observations on changes in the trees, and I would do my best to write down what he was saying, or I would record the numbers of things. Yeah, like and so if I think about my world as an ethnographer, it was him, studying his trees, and I was really young, so I probably wrote things down incorrectly or what have you. But he studied his trees over time and see them become healthier, and they did. And so that inquisitive nature and the observation of change, I will attest to him. And then my father, whenever anything was difficult in life, but especially in work, my dad always had this saying: if it was easy, everyone would be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really interesting kind of, or keep up the good work was the way he would end most telephone calls. And that's, whenever we did work around the house, the farm, whenever we helped with the business, like us kids, like you've got that t-shirt on now, Well-Built Bikes, right?
Mm-hmm.
As children with their trucking business, like we'd go to these big shows where, dad would meet farmers and stuff like that. We would have t-shirts which had Braidwood Fertilizer Services on the back, and we'd have a statement or something on the front, and dad would give us money to go run around the festival, because we were advertising the business,
Mm-hmm.
even though we were still having fun.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the connection between that world and this world definitely through my grandfather. And when I went off to college, I had a year break between school and going to college because I did not want to go to university, right? I was like, I want to live, I want to travel, I want to, and the idea of doing so many more years of schoolwork,
For
basically,
sure.
university, like, and that said, in Australia, it's a lot cheaper than it is in the US. Yet when I took a year off and actually worked on an island on the Great Barrier Reef for 12 months.
Of course you did.
Doing
what?
I worked as a receptionist in a scuba diving center, booking people in for scuba dives, and then I would go out on the boat and help. And there were so many tourists and what have you, and I would help with people getting rigged up to go on their dive. If the beginners classes or what have you, if they had too many people, Andy, one of our dive masters, was like, Kel, throw a rig on, come down with us and just help, just assist, right? And so I did a year of, really living a beach life. I waitressed at night, I scuba dived in the day. It was epic, right? It was so cool. Yet it also taught me that, actually gave me a year to really think about, well, what do I really want to do, right? And that's when I think, culture, people, storytelling, that's what and so then I went off to college, and I think it just connected. I met different people, my fascination with psychology and how human beings, how we work and live. So the social side, it really came out. And when I was in my undergraduate at college in Brisbane, I got an opportunity to work with a data company. And that's where, so in my teen years, I was introduced to computers, but at university, I was introduced to data. So I was introduced to code as a teenager. My uncle, he was a big computer nerd. He worked for one of the biggest computer companies in Australia. He gave us kids as teenagers a really old computer, right? My sisters were like, yeah. And I was like, cool, what does this thing do, right? And we're talking DOS, right? So learning to...
I was wondering, like, what's the timeline here? Like, how old are you? What's the...
You're allowed to ask that question.
Or what's the computer where are we at in time? Yeah,
So
it's
where we're
helpful a
at in
little-
time.
yeah.
So let's just say, so I'm 48 to give
Mhm.
you an idea. So this is over 25 years ago.
Okay.
But, you know, so as a teenager, yeah, just being introduced to the really early, like Ataris and old Macintoshes, like the
Okay,
really
yeah,
old one,
yeah,
the big,
yeah.
you know, it was yeah, and he introduced us to it, and I took to it and thought it was really cool, especially the gaming,
Mm.
the computer games, and also our friends had Donkey Kong, and I was like, what the, you know, and I like love Donkey Kong. My parents refused to, they saw the computer as like a extension of a typewriter, so that was okay. Whereas a Donkey Kong was a computer game, and they were like, no, super interesting. Whereas I could play games on the computer. They just didn't realize. And
Oh,
then
interesting.
yeah, and it was as a teenager, you know, then as I went into college and we moved, so I moved to the city, and that's what you had to do in Australia, right? Living in rural and then moving to the city. But I was waitressing at college, and then I got this opportunity for this job, working on some data and building databases for it was a big tech company in Australia, and I was entry level. And I could do it around my college work. So, you know, because I had to pay my way through college. And it was super interesting because then I started seeing data as language, data as stories. So, and how companies were collecting data on people. It was highly centralized databases because obviously, you know, while the internet was developed in the 60s, you know, World Wide Web wasn't. And this is around, okay, let me really, this is around probably about 1993 to 1995, 6, right?
Okay, yeah.
So to give you an idea of the years, and I was in my early years at college, and it was interesting the type of data frames, computers, it was all, and they were just learning the computer processing power of some of these technologies. And to build databases and how companies were collecting data and information, but it wasn't networked, right? It wasn't until the mid 1990s to late 1990s that the World Wide Web truly started to have commercial resonance. And so, yeah, it was in universities, it was in colleges, or what have you. But so around that time, and that's when I was introduced to an American professor who came out to Australia, and he was talking about the future of the web and network information and data. And Australia's media landscape is very different to the US. Cable never took off in Australia, right? My parents still have 4 channels of public TV that's free to air. Now, you can get streaming now, Netflix, Amazon Prime, and all those. But the cable companies, it just didn't, you know, we're 45 million people. We're a landmass bigger than America. So to service Australia, it wasn't economical for some of those companies. So the way the internet spread throughout Australia was different. And so I was in those early years, American professor, and I'm like, oh, I don't know about this. You know, we started looking into the psychology of technology and media, but the data, it made me realize how, you know, how we build and collect data and information, that information architecture is part of it. So there's one, learning the languages, there's another, learning about data that actually connects systems. And that's where, yeah, I became very fascinated with the psychology behind how devs are building these systems.
And you got that job as like a way to just kind of pay for school. And this is undergrad. Like
Yeah, undergrad.
This is part of like shaping even like, oh, I'm going to get into this, right?
Yeah. And it was early days. Like to me, it was a job I could fit around my college. It didn't mean I was working late nights. It was, you know, really different to waitressing, but it introduced me to this world of how we structure data and information, and actually if I think back to my view on how the builders are the ones that have so much power and agency because they're building the systems. And so it's interesting then to sort of think about, well, who was building these databases? How were they framing, you know, everything in that information? Like it was the very early days for me for starting to think about what's under the hood and who's building what's under the hood, right? I might see something super glossy, but what's going on behind the scenes? And so that's when I realized, you know, to really understand not just the psychology of how people adopt technologies, but what's the psychology of how people build technology. And that's what the psychology of web knowledge is. So And
So I assume then, as you somehow,
Mhm.
because that's a PhD, right? So then there's some kind of like,
Mhm.
there's some kind of just bachelor's in here that was that like just like what was that
So I did a Bachelor of Business
business?
in business, in HR, IT, and marketing. And
Okay.
that's where the psychology came in.
Mm,
And I started to see the business side of psychology. But our IT department at our university, it was more data science than what it was information science. And so, or tech science. So it was really interesting to see it through the business lens, the human lens, the psychology lens. That was my undergrad. And I wrote a paper back then just for class
mm-hmm.
on this notion of these people, of human beings called market mavens, and the psychology of how they collect information to become experts on, marketplace information, not just products and what have you, but, they're fascinated with climate change. They're fascinated with, and they collect market information. And that was a seminal piece of research because it once again helped me see people as collectors of experiences and builders of their lives. But that was my undergrad, and it was, I disliked a lot of the business classes because of how it framed the world of technology. But I was doing all the art stuff on the side, right? Seeing how artists were playing with tech. And it is totally different. Or the social sciences, where they were, telling stories with digital as opposed to just building and selling.
Back then, how were artists using tech?
So back then it was the technology wasn't so much about computing technology as we see it today.
Yep.
It was light shows, right?
Mm,
And very physical means of technology,
yeah.
using computers in sculptures.
Mm-hmm.
They would, it was very different. There
Okay.
are early examples of art through code, but it was just really, and it's more
Yeah.
about the physical form of the art and a statement on society as we became more computerized, more automated, and so forth. So that's what I remember in those early days.
What did you what was your thesis on?
My PhD thesis.
Yeah.
So it was actually on, the title is Psychology of Web Knowledge, yet
That's how it gets that name. So that's not like
yeah.
that's okay, got it. Okay.
So PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, and what I philosophize about the psychology of how knowledge of web and hypermedia technology is developed and built. But I specifically looked also at how different groups of developers. So I hung out with, for 3 years, a group of devs at a company called DoubleClick. And DoubleClick, they built the first anonymous profiling system on the web to profile people based on your behavior. And it was fascinating stuff. And they eventually got acquired by Google and became Google AdWords, if you want to know where that comes from. But it was really interesting to dig into their psychology, but also the gendering of tech, right? And because coding was developed by women, right? Even in the 60s and the 70s, it was seen as a receptional secretarial task to manage computing practices and so forth. So women often did it. It was only in the 80s when IBM really did this huge marketing campaign about computing and gaming that it actually started to become more gendered towards men as computer, nerds, whereas girl geeks have been around for we've been around for a long
The
time.
OGs.
Yeah, we certainly are. So it's super interesting when you look at also the social side of languages, but hanging out with the devs from that company and a couple other companies to really understand their perceptions around what they were building, how they were building it, how they were inventing languages, how they were sharing languages. One thing I love about dev culture is that shareability, right? We're fascinated by what we build, and so we want to show people, and then we collaborate, and it's incredibly collaborative. Unless you work for a company that restricts you on IP, but that's a whole conversation. So those early days framed for me a lot of understanding the culture of development work, build work. Now, then it expanded into community, because in Web 2, when social media started happening, it was all about how communities use technology, how you build community through these social platforms. Even though, you know, MySpace and Friends You United, they've been around for a while. Now it was about all user-generated content.
Yeah.
Right. So the world of the developer expanded to being people who didn't do computer science degrees or weren't mathematicians or weren't fascinated by data, to being anyone could actually start to build. And that's where I'm like, oh, this is interesting, right? As the culture of development work changes.
How do you think that that opening that you're describing affected, so anyone can build, and you're saying that because it opens up because of user generated content, like it's there's all, you could build community, you can build through writing and whatever you create in this space. How do you think that door opening, how did it affect our us as workers, builders? Like what as observation, like what do you think happened there, like for us culturally, as evolution, as however you want to describe that, like what did you see?
Well, I think the notion of what's happened with the web and the internet in general, it's like we've seen a real opening of information, right? So anyone can learn now. It's not restricted to the halls of academia. It's not restricted to being a dev that's working for Microsoft or IBM or what have you. It's now, you know, many companies are tech companies that you wouldn't think are tech companies, right? But individuals, through the joys of a number of different platforms like YouTube, can now learn to code. Or in Web3, which I love even more, it's becoming even more democratic. You know, we're decentralizing even more the ability to learn and skill. If you have the interest, the passion, if someone introduces you to it, that's another way into this, to see it as a language. And it's so starting to have it far more accessible. Yet with that proliferation comes a whole spectrum of different kind of knowledge that you and data you have to, because it's a fire hose, right? But it starts to flatten education systems. It starts to realize that actually, you know, IBM no longer requires a bachelor degree now to work at IBM, right? You have institutions starting to go, actually, we want practice-based, work-based learning. We can credentialize it ourselves using micro-credentials, or if we really want to in Web3, NFTs or verifiable credentials. So it's really opened up the opportunity of learning. So, you know, and so for me over the years, seeing that change. So now everyone is kind of my community.
Yeah.
It's not just devs in, you know, who are very specialized. It's actually, and that was one thing also that came out. We did a project in the UK, The Web Makes Me Feel, on how it made young people feel to have agency over developing content, building communities, you know, being creators. And it was fascinating to see their change and evolution from a young age as a teenager, thinking this is fun, I can build anything. And then as they get older, realizing, you know, the implications of what they're building. And so it's, yeah, it really, so when you say work, to me, there are no boundaries. There's not, I don't go to work and come home.
That's
and
right.
like,
That's right.
There are projects and activities and actions. And whether you're, but then again, remember, I grew up in a family that did a lot of community and volunteer work. My dad's a vet, you know, I'm a teacher. We did a lot of it. And so it's, you know, on weekends and evenings. And so the 9 to 5 is a social construction created by people to control individuals, right?
Yeah, I mean, and before we started recording, and you know, folks that listen a lot know, like this is I'm loving this conversation because we're just so on the same page here with like you're saying everything I want everyone who listens to hear, because I do think culturally the framing that you're pushing back against, like saying it's not just this, but for many it is, and I actually think it is a construct that is keeping us somewhat captive, and ultimately is not going to be for good, for our good, especially as some of this plays out. and having a healthier, like I'm thinking like when you said like you were following was it your uncle or your grandpa that was the trees that was
Yeah, he was the agricultural scientist.
your grandpa, they were
Oh my
following
God.
around like documenting the trees, but you said like to observe, to make observations, to observe change, and but then like to make the ecosystem healthy.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, everything you're saying about what you do when you work with a people group is to make the ecosystem healthy. Like, okay, here is an observation of the closed system, right? So I'll give you like a little analogy that I've reflected on a lot. So we ran a daytime drop-in center for a while, and we think of everything that we do as ecosystem, where a lot of folks that live on the streets could come and make themselves at home on a regular basis, where we couldn't provide homes, we could set that table. And work is central. Like I was saying, like it's really important, especially for folks that don't have employment. So I was like, hey guys, you got to work on something. And so we had these like shipping container with bikes. That's where Wellboat Bikes grew out of. And then we had like gardens. I was like, we don't have work or food, so let's go out and work together and grow some food. And so we had these community gardens, and then we ended up building and this was getting at, we built an aquaponic system where we could raise tilapia. And then it's like this closed thing. So then the fish go to the bathroom, and then that feeds all of the plants as fertilizer. Once it gets converted, they suck out the nitrogen, and they filter the water to go back into the fish. We actually fed fish with some of the plants and the duckweed that was grown in there. So it's this really beautiful little ecosystem. And we were doing it for the food, but I was so fascinated with like the idea of like, I had to the pH balance was really important. And like there was a balance. And like, if something was short, it's like the solution had to be like on this other part of the system that had to be like balanced out. And I realized like doing that little task and like looking at the rest of the operation in the building and the family room and where everyone was in the social area and the free market we had there, I was like, oh, this is this. Right. And if something is not working, if this is becoming, you hear people say it's a toxic culture. If there's something, well, that's a lot like a pH imbalance, right? Like if something is going off here, there's a way to like dial that back, but it ultimately is just this study in healthy ecosystems and how they work. And you were getting that at this early age, like with trees. Now all of a sudden, I'm with the neighborhood and saying like, well, we have this problem, with all this and trying to go, well, and that it makes sense that you then would go. So I then come with ideas. And experiments. Let's try this on this tree and this on this tree.
Let's live prototype, right? Let's live prototype certain things. So one thing that's interesting around this, when I first moved to Chicago, so I've been in America 11 years now, I connected with a youth leadership organization on the west side of Chicago, and they did leadership training and development for young people. It was a place for them to go in the drop-in center after school as well. And what was really interesting, though, it was traditionally structured. So I joined their board. I started to hang out because I lived in the neighborhood, and I met the managing director at an event or what have you. And he was like, oh, we want to do more with young people around digital skills and digital literacies and social media. And I'm like, okay, well, and it was really interesting because they were going to have this big fundraising event, right? And I was like, well, why don't we have the young people run all the digital, social, and web for the event? And they were like, oh, well, they can't do that. And I was like, why not, right? And it was really interesting. But they want to run training courses. And I'm like, no, lived experience. These are young people who are very passionate about certain things in their community. They want to help their community. Great storytellers, like we did a storytelling class with them, and they could be writing different stories and so forth. And I'm like, it's development. But it was interesting, the imbalance in the system, and it often is this, it's governance. And it's adults thinking young people, or people, it's like judgments of one group against another of deficit. And when you see that in a system, that's where I'm like, okay, let's rebalance this. What does it look like for the young people to have more agency over the stories being told online about them? It's about them. They're the stories being told and shared. So it took a while to get the board on board, because the board was about command and control. And we want to control the narrative, traditional marketing, traditional business. That's where my business degree comes in handy, because I'm like, no, let's just disrupt that. And we ran a number of different workshops with young people. It was amazing. They wanted t-shirts that said social crew, you know, that because this was a huge fundraising event. They did everything from learning even how to approach people to ask them permission. Can I take your picture because we want to share it on Twitter or we want to share it on Facebook? But what the actual experience did of them actually running the social media for the nonprofit, firstly for an event, then it became for another event, then it became for another event. Then it's like, oh, could they manage the website? And what's happening as you're doing that is young people are developing their digital literacies in a different way. It's not just documenting my life about me on selfies. It's actually, I'm now in service to a business. And then we ensured they had stipends, so they got paid. So you have this, but the imbalance is the mindset of deficit that a young person or a person on the street or a person of color or an immigrant or a refugee who speaks differently, they're less than, and I know better. Now that's hero complex, and that's, you know, white supremacy and privilege. So for me, it's like identifying in the system where there's not inclusion, where people aren't included in the conversation, don't have power and agency, and as a result, they don't have certain skills. You provide opportunity for skill development like what you did, right? You got a community garden, you've got all these people who are helping out. They're learning like I did from my granddad by helping him out, by doing it. And that's what, so web of knowledge is not just about the knowledge of the web or hypermedia. It's also, that's how knowledge is stored in our brain. It's a web. So one connection goes to another connection, goes to another connection. So, you know, and now it's like when I look back at the nonprofit and the young people are killing it, right? They're blogging, they're doing all sorts of things, and then they're training up the next group of young people.
That's still happening.
Still happening. And it just started by a conversation on, but it means adults, it means people who have privilege and power have to create space and not step in it.
You know, there's
myself included there, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. Well, a lot of in my own work and you know, even initially, like when I first started, I first encountered some guys. I mean, it was one specific guy initially, but like started hanging out with people that like were homeless, lived on the streets in Tampa, and was like, I don't know. I think it started with like, I don't know, I should probably take some food and do something good, be nice, whatever. Yeah. But I sat down with this guy and was telling me your story, and I was just like blown away. But then as I started building these relationships, and it's funny because the reality is I do this work now quite selfishly, I would say. Like it's like, no. Like I found what I've kind of referred to as like a wealth among the poor. There's things that there's vantage point on what's not working here that we are just without. I had this one experience. I had an opportunity to travel to like kind of global poverty, was in Manila, Philippines, and stayed with this family in a slum there for a short amount of time. But there's this beautiful community there. And I had this overwhelming, I actually didn't know what the feeling was, but when I really reflected on it, I realized I was jealous. And it was a weird thing because I was like, man, like I have everything in a material way in comparison. And yet this place that at some material level has very little, had joy like I've never known, had community like I'd never seen, had ingenuity, like, and then the thing, and this is what brought all this to mind, is like the way that things that I would have called trash, an empty bottle, an old banner that I would have called trash, were being turned to tools and awnings and like this amazing like repurposing and declaration of value of things that I did not see and know how to value. And then when I came back here and I started in my own community here, started realizing like I feel extremely impoverished in the sense of like there's something that they have that I am dying to have. Like I'm so jealous of it, but maybe I have I have an extra jacket and I'll use that as an excuse to share that so I can build this relationship and learn from and walk with these folks. And it's this interesting thing, like as you were kind of fleshing that out, like there's such a there's an asset that is overlooked. You're like, oh, they don't speak the language, or they don't look like us, or why would we, they're kids, like we can't listen to them. And yet the wisdom to be mined and found there, to be like share, like just shared together. And actually it's the brilliance of diversity. Like we just see these things from different angles. And like, I don't know, just like reflecting back what I hear you saying, to go, man, like it just so resonates with my own experience of like, those things that are getting wasted are only wasted because of our blindness to their value. And like the illustration of that, I always think of like compost. Like we throw an apple core in a garbage can because we don't see how valuable this is in terms of nutrient.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think what's interesting here is, so, and I'll dive into my skills as ethnographer.
Please.
We have a lot of assumptions. We have a lot of biases as human beings that are developed over time. And to become aware of oneself and what one brings into the space, energy, skills, or what have you, also means stepping back to actually question your assumptions. So when you're in a community, when you're with a group of people, it is not about you, right? So being able to decentralize, and human beings, we centralize all the time. This is about me. I'm going to make it about me. This is how it works. It's like, the youth program in Chicago, for example, it was about the youth. It was their stories. And if there's anything a disservice in most systems, the people for which the system can most benefit or their stories are about, and often not the ones that have the agency or power to do anything about it. So they're being acted on. So I have this saying about education and learning. Education is something done to you. Learning is something you do for yourself. And we learn 24/7, at work, at home, while doing work, if you want to put it that way. Whereas education is this formalized approach to learning, and it's based on a deficit model of I am expert, you are novice, and you're an empty vessel, and I'm going to fill you with information. I know nothing about you from when you walk into my classroom or the lecture hall, or where I see you on the street. Same with someone who's homeless. The large percentage of homeless people in America are veterans, which, my dad was a vet, very fortunate to have access to a health system and a culture and a community that took care of its veterans especially combat veterans, when they come home. And so it's really interesting where these assumptions that we make about people, because we give value to having a house, or we give value to, are they homeless? Maybe they're not. Maybe that is their home. And that's cool. And they're okay with it, and so it's understanding that one's perception of something is different. It's like, and being mindful of those assumptions that you bring into a space. And it's really hard. It's everyday work. It's like just the work I was doing this week in Dallas. I work very hard not to centralize to me, because it's not about me. I'm there to bring a skill set for a community. So it's really interesting, in how we approach and look at this. The other thing in a system to look for is exclusion and inclusion. Where is there people or situations or entities or assets, something's being excluded, something's being included. And that, once again, it's like taking a step back and go, well, why? So there's this whole philosophy around enclosure. And as human beings, we enclose on things because we think it's going to make us richer, better. We enclose on knowledge, information. We enclose on property. We enclose on cars. We enclose on clothes. So basically, we gain it for our own individual benefit, right? And by that, I'm really talking Western culture more than anything.
Sure.
Yet what if we turned it around, and instead of enclosing on stuff, we actually included and opened up? So we could share our table with other people, that you could share your closet with people, you could share your home. But it's interesting to sort of look at, there's the assumptions we make about another's journey or another's situation without knowing the full story. And so that's why the harder ethnography is to collect story, because then you can really deeply at least appreciate someone's journey to where they are now, versus going, you're homeless. Now I'm going to give all my biases as to why that might be so, right? Where in fact it's, Yeah, they're without a home, but they might not be homeless.
Yeah. Like,
But
like,
by
like I
your
don't have a
definition,
house. Yeah.
right? You get me? But then there's other parameters, there's other things to think about in their story and what led them to that situation. And how can, what is your
And by the way, my own experience of entering into these relationships and the way that it transformed me, and a lot of what I would say is I'm trying to the work of the well really is to recreate that experience for others, because the conviction is we need one another.
Oh, totally.
And so I want to set tables, shared tables, where I can get like, oh, you want to volunteer? That's cool. Oh, you want a sandwich? That's cool. But what I want to do is go like sleight of hand. I got you guys to the same table, because I believe that when you enter into a relationship and someone can help steward that in a way that it goes okay, and you can hear one another's stories, you shared beauty, shared pain, and which leads to shared resources and shared access and things like that, to like, and is somewhat of a, our approach to like trying to build a different kind of city, here within our city. I want to ask you, I want to like, what I think so I have two questions. You were talking about the tendency to centralize, and even as the organization, you said we do it as humans, but then the organization said it's about the youth.
Yep.
And then the other thing, and I know they're tied together. I'm going to probably go the other way. Then you said like exclusion and inclusion. So we're in enclosure, or we're trying to the enclosure, like to have something for ourselves rather than to like include or open it up. So I'm going to start there, I think, but I think these are related, but
highly
in a way,
related, and highly related as to why I'm in Web3, right?
It all makes perfect sense. I want to, let's just see if this works. So, I have when I think, why do we do that? Okay. Why do we enclose ourselves? Why do we lock our doors? Why do we shut others out? In fact, the other, let's say that the ones that are excluded, the stranger, the guy on the corner, the person doesn't look like me or speak my language, the other, like the capital O other, we enclose ourselves from, we gate our communities, we protect ourselves off. This is the framework or the concept you're talking about of enclosure, I think. And rather than like open the door and share our table, right? Which it actually, interestingly enough, back to this language thing, and forgive me if I meander through this, but this is like deeply important to me. The people throw the term around like xenophobia, it's just like fear of the other, right? And we English speakers are familiar with that term. What's interesting, I said I was like looking up words in other languages, like original text and things like that. So like in the New Testament, you'll see the word hospitality a lot, and actually welcome the stranger is the most repeated charge in all of like the script, the Jewish and Christian scriptures or whatever. Well, which is, so this idea of hospitality. In the word is xenophilia. It's the opposite of that. It's like the love of the other, right? Okay, so this is what I was getting to here, the enclosure. So it's like the hospitality, and why are we inhospitable to the other? And in many ways, I think it is a fear of the unknown, right? Like, because the reality is like there is some threat to strangers, like even in history, like, well, that tribe brought a disease we wouldn't have no immunity to, like others brought death, and like we're programmed to not want to die, like frantically we don't want to die, we're not okay dying. In fact, we do all kind of terrible stuff in our effort not to die. And at some level, I think enclosure is, I just don't want to die, right? Like, that's why would I lock my door? And why would I? And actually, so I'm trying to tie some of these threads together in this one thought. You were talking about how the study y'all did, I think with young people in, was it UK? Web makes me feel. Yeah. And I just thought, what a fascinating question. And immediately I thought of like the way that people react just to tech in general. So you say like, oh, there's this like, recently in Florida that some friends started like the first like VR school that's happening here in Florida. It's like a charter school. Really cool. I'm excited. So I just tell people like, oh, this is happening. And it's interesting. Some people that are open to technology go, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how that'll work and whatever. But a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, but it's not even like the idea of the school. It's just like the future. Like, and actually one of the, there's an author I interviewed, philosopher author Jerome Miller, which I highly recommend everyone listen to. There's 2 episodes of this guy, but he said, your posture toward the future is your posture toward the stranger, because it's the same thing.
Oh, I like that.
Is the capital O other. It is the unknown. And so the person that can go into the unknown, the pioneer type or whatever, is one who is kind of okay, or at least willing to risk dying at some level, right? And then the one that's like, I just want to not die. That's like, I just want to not die. So I'm gonna lock my door. I'm gonna live in a gated space, community, whatever. This is all making sense. And so I wanted to like kind of bring that, and then I wanted to come back to the organization thing, because like for my own story, like this all started as very, I talked a bunch of dudes into living in a house together, didn't want to be an organization, very much like what is today DAOs was for us then like just intentional community. We had a little hippie commune in the city, sharing with neighbors and trying to like practice hospitality. It's actually how we framed it. Like, it's a house of hospitality. Let's do that. The doors stay open. Like, I wanted to throw them away. Of course, you needed them for some reason, like with mosquitoes and stuff. But like, I thought philosophically there shouldn't be doors. Like, let's throw them away. Right now, that just meant we had them unlocked, or they were open, or you could knock
them glass. Make them glass so you can see.
Yeah. So we really wanted to practice that. Well, in time, as you could imagine, all these people in the house, like it's like, okay, this has to move out of the house. I should probably rent a building. We got to it needed some order. And then I was like, oh, well, I can't rent that building without raising some money. And I can't raise some money without people getting a tax exemption. And I can't get a tax exemption without, filing this. And then I need any liability. So it's all like by way of just the system that is in place. Okay, I have to do this. So it's pragmatically, reluctantly, I said, okay, we'll do all that. And then, so I want to get back to this, like the tendency to centralize. So it's like, well, okay. So we made an organization, whatever. But I was like, I don't know, at some level, like didn't feel like the right DNA. We were really this kind of like decentralized, like more almost anarchist kind of ethos, right? Not in the bomb sense, but in the just like mutual aid and personal responsibility sense or whatever. And like, so then we did that. And it kind of like, I was like, I don't know if I feel right about this. Okay. Now I'm happy we have an organization, and it is quite useful tool, and we're building quite a bit of things, and we're incubating quite a bit of things. And I'm quite happy about that. But we said, well, it's about the youth, but the board had to get on board, and all those things you were saying with that. I actually, what I'm realizing and what I've been thinking a lot about is that centralization, I mean, it is enclosure, but like it's, the decisions that the board are making, like it's interesting, but the logic of the institution itself is to survive, just like the individual. It can't be open to the other or the stranger. It can't leave the doors unlocked, and it must control the narrative. And did I do an okay job bringing this back? And I want to give it back to you, because I was like, okay, doctor of philosophy, like what? Because now take me back through this, because I was like, this is profound what you're saying to me.
So this is what's super interesting in how you're framing fear as and our socialization around fear, and to fear the other, right? Which means not fear thyself, because actually the other can be a spectrum, a group, a whole plethora of different things. But this is about the social ties within community. Because if you have a connectedness, if you have a relatedness with people, they're not the other. They are your friends, they are your neighbor, they are your community. However, we're emerging or evolving as a society where the fear is also a socialization. The fear is also, and it's interesting, there's a couple of studies. Sherry Turkle wrote a book called Alone Together, on how technology is making us more connected, but with less connectedness. So we might be connected to, 5,000 people on LinkedIn. However, we only know 2 or 3 of them, and in a deep, meaningful way. Yeah. And so there's this notion, and human beings are social. We are social organisms. Sure. And that's where we differ from the natural ecosystem on complex systems. We are social. a human being can go for weeks where they can have water, they can have food, they can have access to everything, but if they do not have human contact, it has a huge negative impact on their health. And so it's starting to recognize that where's the culture of care? And the culture of care and gratitude is actually the antithesis of fear. We've also been fed stories about fear because fear sells. So be very mindful of that whole notion of how community has changed over centuries, not just in our modern time, and where we attribute the blame for that happening, in the sense of, and I go back to, as a child, the community work that I did with my dad, especially with veterans, especially, and he had an open door policy. He had a way of making people feel welcome no matter who they were, where they were from. And it's this notion of when do we actually centralize around care, not a selfish benefit for growth or scalability. We as human beings today, I would say, are addicted to scale, more of, like, I've written an essay, I'll share it with you one day. I got an essay called More Me Now, because we're now in this culture where it's about more me, and I want it now. And it's like, actually, that also lends itself to an element of white supremacy as well, which is the antithesis of community-based culture of togetherness. So there's this whole notion of, so when we think about being engulfed in this culture of fear, well, what's the antithesis? Well, Buddhists, for example, have a deep, rich culture around gratitude. And gratitude is actually a healing emotion, and it's a healing practice, and it connects people. So I might say, John, thank you for this. Yet I might also express that gratitude another way, and it'll take our relationship to another level. So to develop understanding takes communication and conversation. Yet it's also, so there's this, I would say, in society, it's like in some societies, I'll be careful not to generalize. Every community is different. Every people's is different. Yet it's this moving away from the narrative of fear that we're being programmed to, which is not necessarily our natural instinct. Our natural instinct is to socialize, is to connect, build community. And so I'm a big, start local, be local, know your neighbor, know your friends, help out in your community, whatever that means to you, to build the social ties, the social fabric that actually makes society healthy. And the opposite of that, I would say, is because the way we isolate, the way we exclude, the way community is, modern cultures in particular, are built on command and control, divide and conquer, which is all military language, right? For example, most business strategy is military language. That's why I reacted to that at college, because I was like, do you know the history of strategy actually comes from? It's the military strategy to divide and conquer and kill your enemy so you can succeed and win. The notion of business is all based on that philosophy and culture. Whereas a really, really good friend of mine, he just retired actually from one of the largest solar companies in I'm going to be geographically incorrect, but anyway, he lives in Vermont. It's all the way up through New York State. And he built his company on the premise of love, that love is the core principle, and care of taking care of each other as well as the planet. And so what happens if we put that at the heart of what we're trying to build? And inclusion is related to it, because when you exclude, you have to ask yourself why. It's not that exclusion is bad, right? Because you can't always have everyone at the table.
Well,
right?
Inclusion actually necessitates exclusion. Like, so when I ran a drop-in center, and there was a woman that was sleeping on an ottoman, which, like, a woman that lives on the streets in this city is like, it's an extremely vulnerable situation, right? And so it was like one of my favorite things in the world, in the middle of a room of 50 other folks that were coming in, is this woman just catching up on like much needed sleep, because she can't sleep ever because it's death everywhere around her. So she's laying on this big ottoman we have, curled up, sleeping all day in the middle of the room. And everyone's welcome here, and she's out, she's fine, just don't bother or whatever. But like the kind of creeper dude in the room that is trying to be, it's just like, well, you actually have to be excluded. Like, I'll tell you, stop and chill, just go sit over there or whatever. It's all good.
Yeah.
But
And
if
take care of
if you
each other.
persist,
Take care.
inclusion of her necessitates exclusion of someone that makes her not able to be here.
Yeah, but that is because he centralizes to himself and his own needs.
Well, sure, but for
Whereas
the
you,
sake of like
right? Yes,
the ecosystem here, I'm like,
of
well,
course.
you
Of
can
course.
do that, but you can't do that here.
Yeah, if
Yeah.
the core principle of the community is safety and love and
That's right.
care, we look after each other, then that does mean
They put you out, they'll put you out like a splinter, like out of your skin, because it's like you just don't belong in this system.
But once again, there's having a conversation about why that exclusion is happening, right?
Yep.
And it might not be exclusion forever. It might be exclusion for now.
It was always one day. Always. We almost never, it was so hard for you to even get a week from us where like we said, try again tomorrow. When you show up, like, don't forget.
Well, and that's the other thing. It's like, so if we go now to exclusion and inclusion, right?
Yeah.
And they're not parallel. They're not like
one's
over here, one's over there, one or the other binary. That's not what I mean. I actually see a lot of these as fluid. They're a system and it flows. So, some people see it on a spectrum. I see it as color, right? It's just really colorful. So, but what's interesting around inclusion and exclusion and this notion of enclosure, the notion of enclosure is if I enclose on something, I'm going to reap the benefit and protect it from anyone else. So you're centralizing to self. And also it's interesting to have a look at it and sort of go, well, why do we do that? It's a scarcity model.
Yeah.
That there's no more of it. So I need all of it. Whereas actually, if we move into more of a growth mindset, actually, if I share this, other people might enjoy it. They might also recreate it. We might create more of it. We might build on it. And who knows where that might take us. So it's really interesting as to what drives enclosure, and it's centralization. And it's centralization for, very individualistic or selfish goals and short-sightedness, but it's built in a scarcity culture, not a growth culture, growth mindset.
So I want to try to illustrate what you just said with a little story that's been profound to me. I've shared it somewhere before, but I was working. This is one of the earlier things I did when I first started like trying to engage. Like I had grown up in a suburb, and I don't know, like something happened along the way where I was like, I'm out, I'm moving to the city. I need to build relationships. And then as soon as that started, like so I moved in, I took a job with the YMCA. They did it's like an after school program for like at-risk youth or whatever, like people that didn't have parents home, kids that didn't have parents home, and then summer camp kind of thing. And it was me and I don't know, one other leader adult in there, and we had 30, I don't know how many kids that were there every day. And it was actually a cool job. They all taught me how to play chess, and man, I learned so much from those kids. Well, there was this one day that one kid showed up, and he had a probably 7-year-old or whatever. He had a king size Snicker bar. And he's like, I got a Snicker bar, and he's super happy about it. He's kind of dancing around, and then everyone wanted it. I wanted it. Like everybody wants the Snicker bar. Like, of course you want it. And everyone's like, oh, you got a Snicker bar. And then he opens it and he breaks a little piece off and gives it to his friend. And I was like, yeah, share a little bit. It's cool. And I was just observing. I was just in the room. No one said anything to this kid. You can have a Snicker bar, whatever. He breaks another piece off and gives it to another kid. And he breaks another piece off and he gives it to another kid. And he breaks another piece off and he gives it to another kid. And he gave everyone, I think he handed me a little bite. He gave everyone in the room a small piece of this Snicker bar, and then he got this small piece of the bottom end of the Snicker. He got a bite of his king size Snicker bar, and no one told him to do it. No one was begging him for it, whatever. And I remember the reason I remember this so much is I'm not like just like I remember that trip to the Philippines I told you about. I don't get like, I have like these basic low level emotional states or whatever, but then I have these like things that just like feel like I got punched or something will happen. I'm like, what was that? And this was one of those moments. I actually like straight choked up. Like I don't do. I turned and I walked out in the hallway just to kind of like pull it together. Like what just happened to me? And I think the initial words in my head was, that is a better human being than me. was the first thing.
Mm.
I was like, oh, he's a better human being than me. But like, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Like for years, I couldn't stop thinking about him.
Mhm.
And arguably, I just, in a conversation the other day, I think I realized, like, it's some level, like, you know, you like, God only knows what comes when you share with your neighbors. I'm like, everything I ever do for the rest of my life, if anything good comes of it, might be because of this kid's little bite of a Snicker bar. Like it was such an impact on me, ethos and all this stuff. And like, and so I was out in the hall, and what I realized though, because you were talking about like, well, you keep it to yourself because of scarcity. The reality was though, maybe in my reflection on this, my understanding, my unpacking of this was, I actually think there was something motivated by scarcity. This was a very poor neighborhood. Nobody had anything. And he intimately knew what it was to not have a Snicker bar.
Yeah.
And the smartest thing to do with a Snicker bar, with your asset, is to invest it in the people that might have one tomorrow.
Mhm.
Like this might be future Snicker bars.
But
Like
he-
it is, but it was so, but not, they're not guaranteed. It's
No.
like, it was like, you know, almost, this
Think
brings out
beyond the Snicker
language of
bar, though.
faith.
Think,
Go, please.
think beyond the Snicker bar. He's using the Snicker bar as a means to connect.
Yep.
He's using the Snickers bar as a way to gift,
Mhm.
as a way to share. So there's a long history of a gift economy and gift culture.
That's right. Have you read the Sacred Economics?
Yes, I have. Yes, I know, right? So it's really interesting in that mindset of a gift economy where you give without the expectation of receipt, of return, and also by giving, you're opening up, and it's not just being including, you're also becoming more expansive, and his network is becoming more expansive. So he's actually becoming more powerful than if he kept the Snickers bar to himself.
And
so the fascination between from Web 1 to Web 2 for me was we went from very closed systems, and we're getting there with Web 3, but we can talk about that because centralization and control and power is still happening.
Sure,
like
of course.
it's, you know, but it's interesting in the sense where as our systems start to open up, it's like this notion of growth, of sharing to connect, is in information and data is happening more and more, which is giving people more power that then they had before, but it's then requires new training. But anyway, back to his Snickers bar, because I think it's a fascinating story. But it's once again, there is often the action of doing something is a symbol to something else. And he's connecting. He does know what it means not to potentially have a Snicker bar. Now, we're talking about his story. What I would love is for him to tell his story.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I'm like,
and he's probably there going, I don't even remember sharing a Snicker bar.
No way he does. No way he does. Snicker bar.
Yeah, what's interesting in what it represents for him is sense of community, sense of sharing, sense of, you know, and he deepened his social power. So actually the next day, imagine if, say it was 10 people he shared it with, right? Or 5 people. If those 5 people had Snicker bars and they share back with him the next day, he's going to have 5 pieces of a Snicker bar. Then, so it's recognizing that a culture of sharing and gifting actually is an exponential return. The social bonds are connected. Do you want to feel safe? Build community.
So I
Don't lock
think
the door. It's a real,
but all of what we're saying right now, I think like it just so maps to, it's like this weird, language, even language of faith, like the seed that's sown and return and like this kind of thing. But it's just like, oh, weird. People think this is about some otherworldly thing, but like it makes so much sense. Like that is what it looks like. But interestingly, I started the word, like we use the frame.
He's investing in the health of his friends.
Well, and then that is what actually I think the word social security means. It's like there is something like resilience in this community, in investing, in having these relationships and these bonds and these connections. And like we use it. It's like, oh, it's a government program that is going to get, whatever. But just deeply fascinated by that. Now, you said something else about centralize around care. And I was curious, like how, and you'd use the guy that said, okay, I wanted to ask you this. Strategy as like this business concept that kind of goes back to military. And then there's like an implied, and you can like speak this, there's like an implied, like, I'm not into strategy. say that. Like,
no, I'm incredibly strategic.
Okay. Yeah. So, and then you're like, but then this guy, and then because I was going to ask, like, well, what's the other thing? And you gave a story of a guy said, well, they made the core principle love.
Mhm.
And interestingly, that's what stood out to me is like, as I started thinking about centralization, so like at our bike shop, we we sell bikes and we try to make revenue, but we exist to meet these needs, these transportation needs in our community. Today, these customer came in, he needed $50 of repairs. They had $1.37. And I was like, it's $1.37 then, we'll do $50 of repairs. And there you go. You're off and running. Cause that sliding scale is at the heart of the program. But like there's another person that has a $200 that can't afford the $200 repair. And they're next, they're not prioritized, whatever. And this actually is like a thing I reflect on to go like, there's a principle decision about like, what is the purpose like that we're here and who is prioritized in these decisions. But with a principle like that, even as a central, like it's an institution, so it's centralized, like at some level there's management and whatever, but like the entity, all entities don't want to die. And there's a way in which it's like, you kind of know when you do this, you're kind of choosing to die, like in a little way, right? Like it's not like in the economic kind of model sense, it's like, this is a bad business decision at just a cost benefit analysis that we make. And I actually think it's something I want to come back to that, like centralized as like an avoidance of dying. And then I wanted to ask, like, how can you centralize around care? Maybe I'm answering the question I have is like, if love is the core principle, I was like, well, what would that mean? And the answer in my head is it would be a business that's willing to die. Like it'd be like, it would have to, what is it, to lay down your life for a friend or something like that. So I see you wanted to react to that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what's interesting here is, okay, you then have to unpack love, right? You have to unpack care. You have to unpack what that means for you in your business, and and your life and your community, which will be different to another community. And that's okay, right? Diversity is a natural principle. It's not, it's a natural organic principle. It's how the ecosystem works, is because it's, yin and yang. Yet what's interesting about the notion of love and care is, so, and there's a story that my mum used to say that I'm going to share with you.
Good.
On how the mother always gets the burnt chop, and a chop being like a lamb chop. Because she's caring for her family, and she wants her family, her children, her, what have you, to have the best, so that they're healthy and so forth. However, she also used the metaphor around, you have to fill up your tank before you fill up someone else's. So, and we do this, you can use the metaphor of when you fly on a plane, and who do you give you have to put your own mask on first. So I think there's a constant dance that we do between, and I wouldn't put it in survival, because actually I think that what we think survival is and what survival actually is very different, right? Your business might fail, so you're still alive, you're still kicking, you move on, you create another business.
Correct. 100%. Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's the significance we put on, is this truly life and death? Is this truly survival? Or is this a psychological survival that you...
By the way, I want to just say with our business, this isn't good for employees to hear though, but like, I'm like, no, the DNA keeps kicking, and it, like, bike shop, it could be anything. It could be anything. But like, this isn't, it's a tool. It's not that important.
But then also, build your business as a community, and you involve your employees in those decisions. You might be surprised the variety of different revenue streams you end up having and the way you sustain it. So, is it about wealth, or is it about sustaining it so it's healthy?
That's right.
So that it serves the community, and you want to keep, you don't want to die because you want to keep serving the community. So there is a natural balance that's needed there. What's interesting around this notion of we have to look after ourselves, but not at the detriment of someone else. And so this is where it's an interesting thing of, you still have to feed yourself, you still have to clothe yourself, but also there are times where actually I'll take the shirt off my back and give it to you because I'm pretty strong right now. And you can see the strength of a human being by how they help someone in a time of weakness as opposed to take advantage of them, right? So there's a whole, I think, here around survival, as in, am I actually going to die, or is this a psychological fear that this has to happen? Because is it around ego as opposed to life or death? So for example, growth and scalability on companies, do they really need to expand the way they're expanding, right? And I'm not going to mention any names, but do they really need, when they're paying workers, not even, livable wages, yet they're expanding and profiting? Now that to me is an imbalance in the system. And it's an imbalance in the system that prioritizes some members of the community over others.
Yep.
It excludes certain members of the community from being part of the decision-making for things that are going to impact them. So that's where decentralization, to me, decentralization is around transparency. It's, you make certain things transparent. Also, it's about opening up the opportunity to be part of the decision-making. And that's what's scary to people, because it's like, well, then I don't have control. Then I don't know what's going to happen. They could vote me out and I'm no longer the CEO. And I say, hell yeah, so do your job well. Have people, so there's accountability and responsibility in a decentralized system that we're not used to. So this is where Web3 to me is fascinating from a psychology of web knowledge, if you really want to go down, the rabbit hole, because we have been so socialized in centralized systems of command and control, military complex, and now it's like, okay, you have groups of individuals. Cooperatives have been around for a long time. Community-based organizations a long time. And so when I see DAOs, I'm like, why don't you go and learn from some of these groups?
For real, it's been doing this forever.
But it takes humility.
It
takes an ego check. It takes communication skills, social emotional skills. We need more social emotional skills in dev work than we actually need in, coding and tech skills, if you think about it, language. It is really looking at this notion of centralization, and we human beings, because like you said, there's this survival instinct, yet we're no longer, out foraging for food to protect ourselves from the beast, right? And having to start a fire to keep warm at night. Yet, so let's unpack survival. And it's a modern day interpretation of a psychological state.
That's right.
You know what? I unlock my door, leave my door unlocked. I'm okay. I'm not. So I think there's a real there's a conversation we have had here around, especially with businesses, organizations. So I see our education system, it's highly centralized, and those that it's there to serve are not part of the conversation on how they wish to learn or wish to be served or what they need. And so it's command and control. And so that's where Web3 is interesting to sort of go, what does it? And data and information is highly centralized, and what's collected on you, where it's stored, who has access to it. And so it's like, we talk about, food scarcity, data and information scarcity. There's a lot out there on us. You just have zero ownership over it.
Yeah, right.
So, but we're going to go right into a whole nother thing there. But the story that you shared, and I'll come back to the Snickers bar, and I think it's fascinating that when you actually include, when you open up and include, so you don't enclose, you grow those connections, and therefore you're safer. Because those 5 or 6 people are going to have your back. And if they have,
I always wonder if like other people that got a little bite of Snicker bar are still thinking about it,
ask them,
many decades
bring them
later,
together and go, hey, do you remember this? I'd love to know what's going on for you. And they're probably like, what Snickers bar? Like,
so how are you like as in the education space? Because the work that you're actually doing is addressing exactly what we're talking about in a very concrete way. Like where are you seeing, I don't know, openings for like cultivating, what are, in terms of steps forward.
So one of the things about our systems of learning, education, advancement, skill development, right? It is highly privileged, and it's all about access, right? and has been for centuries. It was designed, our education systems were designed to benefit certain people, and they were designed to control other people. That's a very simplified view of the history of certain of modern education systems. What's really interesting is when you think of it through a learning lens, as opposed to a formal education system, we're learning 24/7 as human beings. Our brain is constantly processing and in different ways for different purposes, responding to different stimuli. What's interesting with technologies today is how a lot of data and information has been collected on us and our skills, our knowledge, our behavior, and it's being used to profile us. It's being used in different ways. There's new emerging technologies around learning and employment records. If you think about the amount of data every company you've ever worked with or worked on has potentially stored in a database about you. Every school, every university, our kids today, it's like every app they download is collecting data on them and they're learning or they're about who they are and what they're doing. So what's interesting about this is when you want to think about scarcity is the lack of access to us to have any kind of control or consent over that being collected, how it's being used, or what have you. Now let's flip to more, and that's a centralized system. If you flip now to a decentralized system, and this is where Web3 I find quite fascinating. It's imagine these databases and technology systems being built still to collect data and information, yet through a model of consent, so that you have individuals have more control over that data and information and access to learning. And so it's starting to sort of see how technologies that were once used to control, and now we're seeing opportunities for them actually to include more and different people, or for people to push back and go, no, I don't want my data used in that way, and this is why. So I think when it comes to education as well, the access to different kinds of learning and learning styles. So what does a degree even mean today, right? What does credentialing, like a credentialing system, like PhD, to my dad always said this to me and I loved it. It's like, a PhD was an apprenticeship to do research and work on data, right? And a philosophy. Mm-hmm. Yet it doesn't make me better than anyone else. It's a different experience I had to someone else. Mm-hmm. The difference is it was part of a credentialing system that credentialized me. Mm-hmm. We're developing so many skills every day that are never recognized and never, we're not even visible to ourselves. Yeah. So what I'm seeing with emergence of certain Web3 technologies is the opportunity to actually change our credentialing system to a skill-based system, and one where individuals have more control over the information and the data on themselves. So if you apply for a job, you are giving consent for someone to have access to information. So we talk about fear, you talk about Big Brother, we talk about, and all my biggest thing with a lot of my work is who's at the table? Who's at the table making the decisions on that technology or on that education program? Who's it benefiting? Who's it impacting? Because for so long, education is done to you and learners are not part of the conversation. So DAOs, and fascination with cooperatives and DAOs, because imagine if a school was a DAO, right? And parents actually had more say over certain things, or children. One of the schools I worked in Chicago before I moved to Colorado, we had pre-K children. They were learning code, they were building apps. One of my favorite experiences, we had a group of early childhood children who worked with some developers from a tech company because the kids had an idea for an app, right? So we brought in the devs. It was wonderful to see the kids telling the devs not what to do, but how they would design it, code it, build it, what have you, right? Because we have a bias that the younger you are, the less you know, when in fact you don't, right? And it's just different knowledge. And so,
especially with creativity, it's actually quite high when you're young, right? Like we actually train ourselves out of it.
Yeah. So I see the potential for us to rethink our education and learning systems. And so that they're also built from a model of inclusion, not a model of exclusion.
What What
Got a
can
whole
you?
nother podcast coming.
Yeah,
Hold
yeah,
on.
and we can land the plane because I'm like, there's so, but like, what? Just
Yeah.
real quick though, like, what is like you said, what? Imagine if a school were a DAO. One, have you seen something? And then two, like, can you at least cast a vision for me? Like when you said it, I was like, oh, that like really resonated, and my mind is failing me to um like populate it probably because of so like I have a lot of friends that run little cool experiments. Like there's this woman here I've interviewed, Jamie Manfra is a episode I did. She runs what they call micro schools. So they're little private schools and they're like 20 kid schools and they're building a little network of micro schools. And they found this like way to do that through some scholarshiping system to like get money so that poor kids can be in these private schools or whatever. Well, that's cool, but it has to utilize this existing kind of stream. When you said like a school's a DAO, like, cause I'm very much like looking for like how, like if I don't have a kid, but I imagine if I had a kid, I'm like, I don't want them in school. When, like, I just look at what the options are and I'm like, I'd rather them run and stand at the flea market personally. Yeah. Like anything would be better. Come with me to work. I don't know. It's probably, you need something here, right? But there's a lot of other intangibles and socialization, things like that. But like, what does that look like? Cause I'm like, I think I love what you're saying, but I'm failing to, because I go, oh, it sounds so outside of all of these infrastructures. What might that look like?
Messy.
Yeah.
And we have to be cool with that. And so that's what's interesting in our current
legal system. Right? Like is it because like could you do that?
Or cooperative?
Is it effectively like homeschool or like a homeschool co-op or something?
Yeah, it could be.
Because it does have to check in with the state or some sub level.
Yeah. So
right?
And so that's interesting once again. See, so we're still checking in with.
No, this is what I'm saying. Yeah. Like
right. So this is what's interesting. So have you heard of Padawan DAO?
Go on. I don't think so.
Padawan DAO is a group of teenagers who set up a DAO. And you know, it's really interesting to see how they are everything from crowdsourcing their own money so that they can go do boot camps and go to crypto events. And there's huge implications around this. But once again, is it a school? No, let's not call it a school. So maybe I did us a disservice, right? I did us a disservice because I put us in the world of K-12 schools. Let's think learning and think what does
that was helpful. Yeah,
learning, right?
Okay, got it.
So yeah, so from school is actually K-12 is more of a social time for children.
That's right.
Than it is a time of learning. And so that's why the pandemic was so difficult for young people, because they didn't have access to their friends. That's where they would go to socialize. You know, it was so difficult for them. But if you think of just learning and our systems of learning and how we are wrapped up right now in an economic model of credentialing that benefits certain people, benefits institutions, it benefits, yet it doesn't benefit the people it's meant to be benefiting when you really think about it. And so it's what happens if we rethink about our view of credentialing and who can credential and what they're credentialing, and all credentialing is an independent recognition that you have a certain skill. Yeah. Or that you have. So my PhD is just a confirmation that I spent 5 years on a research project and I met certain goalposts along the way. Like I disagree with the model or the idea of higher education and K-12 because it's indicating that higher education is higher and better than high school, and it's not. Just different. Community college is different. Technical college apprenticeships are different. Work-based learning is one of the best learnings that you can do. Most devs learn on the job. They don't learn in a program or a course that's separate from the work that they're going to be doing on their daily basis or what have you, or that they're passionate about. Yeah. Work being in action, not work being employment.
It's definitely what resonates with me.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, let's just unpack the model of learning and really think about how do we recognize learning? So I believe in a tri-model of recognition. And a tri-model of recognition is, so at the moment, you have to do a course, a class, and someone gives you credit or they recognize you, and they're the expert and I'm the novice. So it's an inaccurate system right there. Because one, you're elevating one over the other. If you make it a triangle, so I self-recognize, yes, I self-identify, I have these skills in these areas. I've been working with you, John, for a period of a couple of years at Well Built Bikes. You then also recognize me for certain skills. And then you have an independent evaluator who recognizes me for certain skills. Triangles are often decentralized. When you have, if you work in 3, 6, 9s, it's a lot harder to centralize than if you're actually 2 people, 4 people. It's really interesting when you look at the mathematics of centralization. I see it all comes from the natural world too, from ecosystem.
Please, can we do this again? I'm not going to ask you the question because my brain just exploded. I'm going to be thinking, I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight. That's going to mess with me. Keep going.
And conflict. This is why, so in relationships, it's like if you have 3 people in a household versus 2 people versus the relationship changes just based on the number, let alone the dynamic of energy.
That's right.
So, so if we look at how we recognize learning and skills, let's focus on the skills. Let's focus on who's recognizing them. But what we've done is we've elevated organizations as the experts on education and learning. And I benefited from it. Many people benefit from it, but most people don't. And so is it actually working for the care of society for learning? Could we look at our models of, so for example, I was surprised, I've got a talk on education innovation that I'll send you. It's a TEDx talk.
Jeez.
And it looks at how K-12 can learn some things from post-secondary can learn from things from K-12. Yet, because they're both learning models, yet most professors at university never do any kind of teaching, learning. They don't learn about pedagogy, curriculum, what have you. They learn to be scientists and are experts teaching. Yet our teachers in our schools spend anywhere from 4 to 6 years training in the science of learning. So why is it that a post-secondary institution is then seen as the expert on learning and education? They're like expert on science, definitely. So, and the value of a degree, right? So when you think about associates, bachelors, PhD, masters, these are brands of credentials that support an economic model that benefits certain people and not others. And if you're part of the system, good to you. If you're not, if you're excluded. So this is where the model of DAOs, and let's just be clear, decentralized autonomous organizations. How can we decentralize? How can we decentralize our organizations, make them flatter, make them more transparent? A DAO doesn't work, for example, and I've been part of a couple. I've been studying them for 2.5 years. And what's super interesting is if they're not transparent, if they're not open about their information, even if there's a core group who make the core decisions, they will fail because it builds distrust. When you're not transparent, when you don't share information, people make up stories. People lean into their assumptions and you will fuel distrust. Transparency, and make your information available, like your company or your organization, Well Built Bikes, make the information available. And it's interesting then to start to have conversations about it, inform people, as opposed to enclose on information. But you and I, this is, I'm glad we're doing this.
Let me I'll ask you 2 hopefully quick questions. We'll call it a night. So I know my wife's texting me as well. I try to ask everyone this. So I want to make sure I get this question in. How would you define success?
How do I define success? Connection.
It's great. I love that. So people that are listening, are there do you have an ask for those listening? Like, is there ways, well, one, is there a way they could find you, follow you, anything that you're doing, they could support, any other asks or encouragements? Just want to give you space for like kind of plugging things and connecting folks.
So, to reach out to me, I'm pretty much on any platform as Dr. Kelly Page. You can find me, whether it be LinkedIn, Insta. You'll see that I'm quite polymorphic. There's some art in there. There's science. There's learning, education. There's family. don't hesitate to reach out. I'm very accessible. Relative to my ask for people, invest in the learning of others and invest in the learning of yourself. Learning is growth. And that to me is how we grow community. It doesn't have to be formal courses or tutoring. Find the way that you could invest in the learning of others. And if we do that as a community, as a society, then we all learn, we all grow, we'll all elevate.
This is so good. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And I'm gonna be begging you to do it again. Really.
It's been
you.
fun. It's been super fun. You're super intelligent, and I love what you're doing for your communities, because you're investing in the learning of others.
We try.
Yeah.
We try.
Appreciate it.